So, a little setup here. The reason I chose Bob for this day. When I speak with pastors who are retired, older than me, a little more seasoned in ministry, many of them reflect that today's political environment reminds them of what it was like in the late 60s, early 70s, the division we experienced in our country. The cultural moment of, sexual revolution and civil rights movement and of course the Vietnam War. And Bob served in Vietnam. He has a powerful testimony to share. And so I wanted Bob to share that story with us. So Bob, why don't you start with wherever you feel led.
Well, I grew up wanting to be a pastor. My goal was to be Dave. I was in the Lutheran church, worked my way through high school, went to college, was in pre-sim at college, and preparing to go down that road. And two friends of mine, during an argument one day about Vietnam, and I will tell you I believed we were right in Vietnam at that time, challenged me. Bob, if you really believe that, put your money where your mouth is and go volunteer. And at the end of the semester, I did exactly that. I volunteered for the Army and volunteered for Vietnam. Went through basic training and AIT and all that. And the Army, in its great wisdom, sent me to Germany. And I spent 2 years in Germany. During that time, I volunteered for Vietnam 3 more times because I really believed I needed to be there. Never got sent until my last year in service. And I came into my office, I was going into 13 months, and there were my orders for Vietnam. I went to Vietnam, served as an advisor, which means I lived, breathed, ate, slept with the Vietnamese. My unit was 16 Americans and 6,000 Vietnamese combat rangers. We did everything with them and for them. I actually extended my time there a little bit because of the situation we were involved in and spent 15 months in Vietnam. Came home in 1971. And Dave, you're right in what your pastor said. This country was torn apart at that time. It was torn apart by Vietnam, it was torn apart by race relations, it was torn apart by, you name it. Everybody hated somebody.
Right.
When we would send people home to bring bodies home, we sent 2 soldiers to bring the bodies home. And those soldiers would often stand at the end of the casket in respect for this person who had died. And they were almost always spit on and called names. I came home in the middle of the My Lai trials. The trials were condemning 2 American companies of infantry for the massacre of 500 Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children. They were found guilty. Everybody hated the people from Vietnam. I flew home, landed, they took my uniforms away from me and said, we'll mail them to you because I had to have them. They told me to take my uniform off and put civilian clothes on. Never tell anybody where you've been. Never tell anybody what you've done. Never talk about your time in the Army. Basically, they had taken 4 years of my life and canceled it.
Right. And they probably thought they were doing good, helping you, but that had terrible impact, I know.
It made me first of all believe and feel that I had done something wrong. And second of all, made me cancel that 4 years of my life. I never talked about my time in service. For 40 years, even my wife didn't know that I was in Vietnam. I didn't talk about it. I tried to play like it didn't exist. Until Vietnam came back and visited me again 40 years later. And I'm going to go back a step. I came home from Vietnam, and for the next 20 years, I never held a job for more than 3 years. I never stayed in the same city for more than 3 years. I had no focus. I had no center to my life.
Those days of being a pastor.
Yeah. I didn't feel like I could be a pastor because I didn't have the moral stance that I wanted to be that. I don't know that I've ever gotten all of that back. But 40 years after I came home, I walked into a doctor's office with God's hand on my shoulder, and that's a much longer story. And the doctor told me, Bob, you have advanced prostate cancer, directly related to Vietnam. I had dealt with Agent Orange in Vietnam, and hundreds of us came back with prostate cancer. I had surgery, spent 5 days in the intensive care, and they were ready to send me home. And forgive me for this, guys. I got up to go home that day, and the entire staff of the hospital section that I was in was lined up outside my door. And every one of them shook my hand and said, thank you for your service. And it was the first time in 40 years that anybody had said thank you. It's the first time that anybody had said, Bob, you can be proud of what you did, or you can accept what you did. And it changed everything about my outlook pretty much. From then on, I've been able to talk about Vietnam, and I've been able to say that I have ribbons I can wear, and I wore a uniform. It was a complete change in my life and turned my life around, because from that point on, I held the same job for 25 years and have been married for, we were talking about this yesterday, 30 years, I think, 30 plus somewhere.
I hope you got that right. For your sake.
Yeah, I agree. And have lived here in Indy for all that time. So that turning point in my life completely changed who and what I was.
Can you share a little bit about when you used to serve downtown?
Yeah, I got a divorce from my first wife and had holidays free. She had my daughter at that time. I called my pastor and said, what can I do? I have no family here. I'm free. And he sent me to a little tiny mission downtown. That started almost 18 years of cooking in the homeless missions here in Indianapolis. I actually ran one for 17 years. We served 300 people every Sunday. We were the only hot meal in downtown Indianapolis on Sunday, just as an ad. We still support them here at this church. But at the time I started, about 75% of the people we served were Vietnam veterans. Now, they're all dead now. You don't live on the streets that long. But all of us that served, in my opinion, all of us that served in Vietnam left something in Vietnam. Left a part of our spirit and a part of our hearts. All of us came home feeling dirty, came home feeling incomplete. Many of us came home with addiction issues, alcohol, drugs, whatever. Many of us came home not able to go back to a normal life and ended up on the streets and ended up dying way too young. It was a horrible war, and it was a horrible cost to this country. I told Dave this story earlier. There's an organization out there right now. I'll tell you two quick stories about organizations. There's an organization out right there right now that basically says, Vietnam didn't kill me, but it's still trying because of Agent Orange. But the second one is this. I was somewhere 2 or 3 years ago, and a guy walked by me and saw my Vietnam hat and said, welcome home, brother. He'd been there too. That set me off on a journey that anytime I now see someone I know served in Vietnam, that's my greeting. My greeting is, welcome home, brother. The first thing you learned in Vietnam was not to get close to people because they weren't going to be around long. It was a horrible, costly war. We had to come home and had to accept ourselves before we could accept each other. But now I think we're starting to accept each other and realizing we're brothers.
Bob just told me that this morning, and the first thought went through my head when he said that phrase. I thought, that's what should have happened in the prodigal son story too. welcome home, brother. And the words that the older brother couldn't bring himself to say were the words that you needed to hear and that you now offer anyone you see, know, that wears the shirt or the hat or that you can just tell is served.
Yep.
And what a powerful phrase it is. Welcome home, brother. Any last words? Hey, Bob's going to lead us in prayer, but any last thing you want to say?
I see where we are today, that a word, a phrase can separate us, that we take people we love and drive them away because of one particular belief. And I look back on the 60s and 70s and hate it. And I hate to use that word, but I hate it because we're all one. We are brothers. We are sisters. We are family. And we have to treat each other that way.